Can you guys hear me? No? There, that sounds like it. So today's sermon is entitled Motherhood on the Brink. I have to make an admission to you guys. I'm not a mother. I'll freely admit also that I don't have very much maternal instinct. But tomorrow's Mother's Day. And so it's time for us to honor the people who ensure that we are cared for and raised as we give out the flowers and the chocolates and all that great stuff today. You can't stress enough the simple fact that without mothers, humanity would not have a future. So I wanted to explore some of the stories of motherhood in the Bible. And my thought immediately jumped to the book of Ruth. So Ruth's story is only 4 chapters long, but it begins with Naomi and her husband Elimelech deciding to take their family and pack up and move to Moab. There was a famine in Israel, and Moab had better prospects. Unfortunately, the first chapter of Ruth is rather depressing. First, Elimelech dies, and their 2 sons marry Moabite women. But after 10 years, they also die. This leaves Naomi with her 2 daughters-in-law who have no children. Naomi's not Israelite, and the 3 of them, because they don't have any men in their lives, they have no social security. So Naomi decides she's going to pack up what she has and head home to Israel. She tells her daughters-in-law to go back to their families. She has nothing left to give them. Orpah, the first daughter-in-law, agrees, albeit with a lot of weeping. It's really evident that Naomi, she's greatly respected by her daughters-in-law. So Ruth, though, she's also weeping, but she just straight up refuses to leave Naomi. She decides to follow Naomi right back to Israel. And I'd really like to point out the high esteem that both Orpah and Ruth had for Naomi. Orpah's decision to return to her family, it wasn't easy. She probably knew that she had a warmer welcome waiting for her than Ruth, or it's possible that she just saw the logic of what Naomi was telling her to do. But Ruth and Naomi head back to Israel, where they're greeted, or at least Naomi is greeted, as a returned neighbor. So she's given a warm welcome. They have effectively nothing. There is mention later of a piece of land that would rightly belong to their family line, but despite that, Ruth has to go out gleaning in other people's fields, which indicates to me that the land had little value to them, at the very least due to the fact that they have returned at harvest, not planting. Am I too short? I have 3 siblings, and the next one up is 5'11", so I'm the short one in the family. Anyway, so they're back in Israel, and Ruth is gleaning. They've returned at harvest, not planting, so the land they had has no value to them. So if you're unaware if you're unaware of the obscure biblical trivia, gleaning, it's a provision made by God in Leviticus 19:9 and 10, and it requires that farmers leave some of their crops in the field on purpose, so that the poor would have something to go and get as well. This is kind of the equivalent of a food bank, which tells you a lot about what condition Ruth and Naomi are in. They're poor. They don't have anything to show from being in Moab. Ruth is out gleaning, which is a rule put in place to ensure the impoverished can just eat. And Naomi appears to be severely disabled due to either old age or severe depression. And on top of all that, they're two unaccompanied women in a culture when they do not have as much legal standing as a man would. So Ruth goes out gleaning, and Naomi stays home. This stood out to me. I have yet to crack the code on grain production, but I do garden, and so does my mother. The fact that Naomi isn't out in the field with Ruth stood out to me when I read this. She's getting older, but she shouldn't be quite so incapacitated as it seems she is. She did just hike from Moab back to Israel. And at least with gardening, in my experience, there's always something you can do sitting down. But while gleaning, Ruth catches the eye of Boaz, who is the owner of the field she's gleaning in. And once he knows who she is, he makes sure she's cared for. Boaz has heard the rumors around town. So I Googled the population of Bethlehem today, and it's 30,000. That's still pretty small. There's absolutely no way that it could have been that many people back then, though. Ponoka, where I live, has a population of about 8,000. And frankly, even that's probably really high. You've got a community here that's small enough that the news that Naomi and her daughter-in-law are back has got all the way around town. So Boaz has heard of them. And here's the really interesting thing. Boaz knows about Ruth. And what he's heard, what he knows, is how well she's caring for her mother-in-law. So when Ruth returns home, Naomi hears what has happened, and the wheels in her head start turning. She knows who Boaz is, and she sees an opportunity. So she sends Ruth out again. This time it's not for grain. She's out to glean a whole new husband. And Ruth goes along with this plan. She goes right out and essentially proposes to this man she barely knows, based on a custom which is completely foreign to her. And that works. Boaz says he will, just as long as the one other closer relative who has first claim decides not to, which he does. And their marriage brings them a son who ends up as an ancestor of both David and Jesus. This son really seems to be rejuvenating, though, for Naomi. She becomes the caretaker of this child, who is referred to as her son also. And she's the one who's taking care of him. This woman, who'd just been too sick to work, she gets enough life back in her that she wants to spend her retirement chasing her little toddler grandchild. So we're going through step by step and break down some of the aspects of this story. For starters, Ruth ended up being an ancestor of both David and Jesus, which is really interesting when we turn in our Bibles to Deuteronomy 23, verse 4. I'll give you guys a second to get there. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. It's interesting that this isn't even alluded to in the book of Ruth. And so being a millennial, I Googled it. Why is this happening? One theory I read was essentially that being a woman, Ruth wasn't really part of that prohibition. She kind of skated under it. But that doesn't hold water, in my opinion, when you cross-reference with Ezra 9, verse 1 and 2, which is after this, but it explains that marrying women of Moab and Ammonite and other nations had led to emulating their religious practices. I believe there's a really simple explanation why no one questioned Ruth's integration into Israel, and it's found right in the book of Ruth. Ruth was very obviously highly respected by the community of Bethlehem for the fact that she was caring for her mother-in-law. Her sister-in-law has returned to Moab in chapter 1. Ruth, though, followed Naomi, determined not only to care for her mother-in-law, but in Ruth 16 and 17, if you want to go there too, Ruth 1, 16 and 17, it says, "Do not ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." So Ruth, she's making it clear that she's devoted to her mother-in-law, but she's also making it clear that she is going to devote herself to the God of her mother-in-law. Once in Bethlehem, where this story unfolds, news of the pair spread very quickly, and the report given of Ruth is extremely positive. In chapter 2, verse 11 of Ruth again, Boaz says, "I also know about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers." Think about that. Like, really. The first thing people knew about Ruth was her devotion to caring for her mother-in-law, who must have been an elderly and ill woman, since she couldn't come out and help with the harvest as well. Because of Ruth's character, there was no question and no objection to her joining Israel. Generalizations about the character of Moabites, it could not overrule what they were actually seeing in Ruth herself. I'd like to also take a moment to look at Naomi's story within the book of Ruth also. Naomi has had a very tough time. Her husband dies in chapter 1, verse 3. Her sons have 10-year marriages without having any of their own children. And the text would appear to indicate also that her two sons die very close to each other. She's ended up widowed and without her children just really fast. So Naomi is mourning the loss of her entire family. And she's a foreigner in a foreign land, and she feels as if God is punishing her personally. I hope by now you've kept your Bibles open to Ruth, because we're going to spend a lot of time in Ruth. If you'd like to turn to Ruth 1, verse 13. Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, "Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." That's harsh. Naomi thinks God has it out for her, specifically. I've been in that place. I'll admit that, you know? And I'm also sure that a lot of you have experienced feeling like you're in that position for one reason or another, and quite often probably in your struggle to become mothers even. Ruth gets the headliner in the book of the Bible, but we have two women who are going through something very difficult and scary. In summary, so far, we have two women who are both widowed, they're childless, they've left their home cultures, both of them, and they're experiencing poverty, and really deep poverty. In addition to that, Naomi is beyond childbearing age, and Ruth has just effectively abandoned her entire extended family. In the eyes of the world, this situation would appear hopeless. And in the eyes of Naomi, it also appears hopeless. They get to Bethlehem, and they're greeted by those who remember her. And what does Naomi say? Ruth 1 verse 20 gives us the answer to that. She says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Instead, call me Mara," which means bitter. Naomi's in the dumps. I don't think we can stress that enough. She thinks she's failed outright at motherhood. She doesn't have the opportunity to try again. And it's something that's really culturally important and also biologically driven. So that's really important to her. But here's the interesting thing. Naomi, who's in the dumps, who's depressed beyond all measure, she's made a huge impression on Ruth. So much so that despite her misery, despite the fact that she's trying actively to disconnect herself from Ruth, and her advanced age, the fact is Ruth is going to follow her into uncharted territory. Naomi must have been an absolutely incredible woman who was demonstrating God's love so well, despite her view of God as having it out for her somehow, as trying to punish her, that both of her daughters-in-law are heartbroken at the thought of leaving her, and Ruth refused outright. One thing that stood out to me reading chapter 1 of Ruth is how much crying there was. Naomi should be considered a hero of faith, in my opinion, for anyone who's experienced depression or is experiencing depression. Really, who here can say that they love their mother-in-law so much that if your spouse dies, you would want to go and live with your mother-in-law who is clearly experiencing a depressive episode? Come on, hands. All right then. I think that by today's standards, Naomi could probably be declared to be having some type of mental health crisis. Naomi saw herself as a failure of a mother. Her sons have died. She has no heirs. Her daughter-in-laws are Moabite. And let's just be honest here. I think that would probably have to sting for her a little bit, even if she's not letting it on. And she's returning to her homeland with nothing, except for this one daughter-in-law who really, truly loves her deeply. Naomi refers to Ruth as a daughter in chapter 1, verse 12. But I don't think it's really clicking for her yet up here that she has this child, her adopted daughter, Ruth. Despite this, Naomi is still acting as a mother would. If you want to turn to Ruth 3, verse 1, Naomi sets to work. And I can personally attest that mothers and other women in your life tend to do this, to try and get Ruth married off. She wants to ensure Ruth will be cared for permanently. And Boaz, who is a close relative of her deceased sons and husband, and he's demonstrated kindness to them in the past, appears to be her go-to. This demonstrates a shift in the way Naomi is thinking. Previously, she's stuck on her misfortune. She's stuck mentally in the past. But here she begins to start thinking forward, thinking towards the future and towards building something new. Ruth has demonstrated her devotion to Naomi continually throughout the book. And when Naomi suggests this really weird custom, Ruth is on board. It's interesting to me, and I want to get a little sidetrack here. Ruth is continuously referred to in the book as a young woman. When in chapter 2, Boaz asks who Ruth is, he says, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" That's in verse 5. I looked it up on YouTube again, and apparently in Jewish tradition, Ruth was 40 when these events occurred. I'm not sure about that, but it can probably be said if she'd had a previous marriage, which lasted a very long time. If she'd been married in her early 20s, it's reasonable to assume she's in her 30s. I know it's common to say that people got married younger back then, but what I've read is actually that marriage in early teens was almost exclusively a political contraption to form alliances, not so much marriages. And regular people they waited. They waited later. Regardless, the point I'd like to make is that Ruth had gotten out of a 10-year marriage while still qualifying as a young woman. The idea of being used up or not retaining your value is, biblically speaking, nonsense. Also, you're young until your 40s, guys. I want to believe that. So Ruth is on board with her mother-in-law's plan, though. And she's setting out to fulfill a custom which must have seemed foreign to her. You marry the relative of your deceased husband in order to produce a child who will be, legally speaking, your first deceased husband's child. But, even for us, that seems a bit weird, doesn't it? But Ruth is on board. She's ready to do it. Boaz is not a young man. In fact, in Ruth 3, verse 10, he says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed me earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether they're rich or poor." Boaz is a bit surprised that Ruth is coming after him, and probably just a little bit flattered. Coming into this marriage, you really end up with three people who have very odd positions. Naomi has lost her sons. She feels she has failed in some great way, and her involvement is not direct. She has no relation biologically to either Ruth or Boaz. Ruth, on the other hand, she's had a previous marriage which failed to produce children after 10 years, which means she's likely dealing with some form of infertility in that marriage. It's not just women who can be infertile, but in the cultural context, they get the blame for it. Even in our society, the burden of infertility is disproportionately on women, despite the fact that we know full well it can affect both people. Beg pardon. Sorry, recovering. So for both of these women, much rests on if they can get an heir. Both of their futures rely on having a male child who can grow up and take care of them. Boaz is also in a really odd position, though. He knows he's older, but he has a strong sense of duty to his deceased relatives who need an heir, but also to these two women he can see they have very excellent characters. He stands personally to gain nothing, concrete at least, from this union. The children born will technically belong to Ruth's deceased first husband, and the child will be inheriting separate from any children Boaz may have from other marriages. So the piece of land that's connected to them will never really be his. But the wedding's successful, at least by the standards of the day, as Ruth finally has that son. And here's the thing. Every single character's relationship to this child is kind of unique and unexpected. Boaz is the father, not technically, but that's weird. He has to raise this child, thank you, as the son of his deceased relatives. He has to raise this kid as somebody else's kid. Ruth has married into a foreign culture, And you're going to say, oh, well, she did that the first time. But there's a difference between marrying a foreigner in your culture versus going to a completely foreign land to marry a foreigner in their culture. She also probably has something to prove. This kid is kind of the proof that she can have children. Which, like the struggle with infertility is often extremely distressing to people, so it's a relief. Naomi here, Naomi's grandma, but she has no biological connection to this child at all. The story of Ruth is a story about the quest to become a mother. That journey is full of twists, turns, and a very unexpected means of fulfillment. Naomi, she loses her sons, but she adopts a daughter-in-law who gives her a grandchild. And if you guys could turn in your Bibles to Ruth 4, chapter 15, I'll give you a second. I like this verse. Ruth is referred to as being better for Naomi than 7 sons. The child Ruth bears is fully acknowledged as Naomi's as well. This child is fully and completely Naomi's heir. Ruth has come through uncertainty, widowhood at an early age, and moving into a foreign and strange land to have a child that would love and nurture her the rest of her life. And this child, Obed would become the ancestor of the 2 most influential men in Israelite history. Obed is Ruth and Naomi's legacy, proof of their lives and the impact on the world. I think it's worth looking at those descendants. Well, at least Jesus. We don't want to spend too much time. The world's Redeemer counts these people as his direct ancestors. A woman who shouldn't have been in Israel, a family who suffered much and had at times not seen a future. Jesus' family line was full of misfits and oddities. I'll admit, when I got writer's block writing this, I went and stared at the genealogies a little bit. The story of Ruth demonstrates God's intentions in building the lineage he would give to his own son. That lineage is full of struggles to have children. It's also full of misfits, people who are odd. Some of these people messed up their own lives. Some had their lives messed up by circumstances. That's how God builds his family. He takes people who are sinful or outside the fold or impoverished or struggling with depression or infertility or loss, and he builds up a legacy for them. For us to all be a part of the family of God. Thank you for your time today, guys.